What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode of Faith Unaltered. I'm your host, Tyler Fowler, and with me as a panel of awesome guests that I absolutely love with all of my heart, we have my co-host, Joshua Davidson, my co-host in the making, Dale Glover, and our good friend and brother in the Lord, Colton Carlson, with us tonight to dive deeper into the conversation that we've already started on Calvinism, Compatibilism. We've had a host of shows on this topic. I plan on, whenever I get some time, to put them in a, what do you call it? My mind's going blank on me here. On YouTube, basically dang it, I forget what that's called. So where you can access all the videos at once instead of having to look through them or look for the playlist. That's it. Duh. Anyway, so I plan on doing that at a later time. So like I said, you can easily find these episodes where we have discussed, intro, and now we're kind of diving into the weeds. And so if we talk about concepts that you guys have no idea about, please go back, check out the videos that we've already done on this subject, and hopefully that will clarify some of the issues that we raise tonight. But without further ado, Joshua Davison, brother, how are you doing? It's an honor, as always, to have you with me. And what's up, man? Anything new?
I'm still getting over a cold, so I am doing better than yesterday, but not as good as I will be tomorrow. But I'm hoping that my voice will hold up the entire time that we're speaking. I haven't done a lot of talking the last couple of days because my throat is still kind of tender. But I have water on standby, and I took some cough syrup before we started, so I'm hoping that it'll hold up.
So he's drugged and hydrated.
Yeah, exactly. So I had a decent Christmas. Looking forward to a good New Year. Like Colton, I'm going back to work tomorrow, and I'm mourning the loss of my time off to a cold, but that's okay. It's it is what it is. Had a good Christmas. The kids, got away with more toys than we have room for. Had to go through and sort through their stuff to make room for all the new blessings. So it's been a good weekend, and as a dad, it's fulfilling to see my kids happy. So I'm happy.
Right on, brother. Out with the old, in with the new. That's what I'm saying. So I did not realize this. My parents, like, God bless their heart, whenever they got me stuff for Christmas, they had to get rid of the other stuff, like the old stuff. And I didn't really know where it went, right? But now as a parent, I kind of get it, right? We're going to give, our gifts that Kelsey don't play with anymore that she got last year. We're going to give them away. I know there's a family kind of hurting right now. I know Lacey's made arrangements to give their kids some stuff that Kelsey like no longer uses or whatever, just to make room for the old stuff and to bless a family that's a little bit less fortunate than we are. And so that's kind of what we've done. We had a good Christmas as well. Kelsey got Minnie Mouse galore stuff. I swear I never thought in my years as a bachelor I would have as many Minnie Mouse items in my house as I do now. But dude, I do. And you know what? I'm happy about it. And so Dale, how is your Christmas, brother, all the way up there in Canada? And anything new with you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys.
Absolutely.
My Christmas was great. Spent it with the family and stuff like that, and had a good time. Had my turkey dinner as usual for Christmas dinner, and was really enjoying the holidays there for sure.
Did you get anything new for Christmas? Anything that you really, really needed or really, really wanted that just made your Christmas just that much better? Or
So I didn't really have a list of demands, or like not demands, a list of like things that I really wanted this year. So I just kind of left it up to them. Just get me whatever, and I'll be happy with it. So yeah.
Cool, good. I'm glad you got what you wanted. And that that's kind of like how if it's not work clothes, right, then get me a Logos gift card. That's all I'm asking for. So I'm not trying to be too demanding with that, but if you don't give me clothes, then please get me something that I'm actually going to use, you know what I mean? And so with that being said, Colton, brother, it has been a minute since you've been on. We are glad to have you back to continue our conversation that we've had. And bro, how was your Christmas? And I know you're going back to work tomorrow, so that sucks. But how are you doing tonight, bro?
I'm good. Holidays were good. I just echo what Josh and Dale said. So I love seeing my kid happy. It's a blessing. She got way more toys than she probably will ever use. My wife's amazing because she came up with this rotation system where she puts old toys in like a chest and keeps it there for a couple months, and then till she gets bored, and then she rotates the toys. So then it's like all new again. And I was like, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
So
is it just the one kid?
She's only a year and a half, so we haven't quite had the years, I guess, to kind of pilfer through all the old.
Is it just the one daughter?
Stuff. So, but
do what, Josh?
I was saying, is it just the one daughter?
It's just the one, right? So her name is Millie. She's a year and a half. She's cute as junk, and I love her.
Congrats, bro. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That is fun. That is fun. So she's a year and a half. So it's so cool. So whenever my daughter was a year, she didn't really know what to do with the Christmas presents that we give her. We was like, hey, open them, go crazy. And she's just like, this year, whenever they hit 2, oh man, they're into it, bro. So it's really exciting to see them just ripping and tearing and all that fun stuff. And so I can't wait till next year to see what that brings. But y'all, we have got I think a good show lined up. And so what we have done in the past, I kind of mentioned it earlier, and then I'll let Josh explain a little bit more details if need be. But what we have done is we've done a bunch of shows. So I think this is our fifth or sixth show on the topic. Normally we have the Mullen Aside with Dr. Tim Stratton. And then we have had a conversation with Colton and Tyler Vela in the past about Calvinism, about determinism. We've also talked to Chris Date on the subject, Andrew Elliott, and Jeremiah Short, the Black Doctor from TikTok. And so this is a conversation, and this is a subject that we are pretty familiar with. I will say this. And I was telling these guys before we went on, Colton has opened me up to a plethora of material that I never knew existed before. Okay. Tempe, Franklin, all of these philosophers that just go past Guillaume Bignon and Tim Stratton, right? Like who are all these people? And man, I got Guillaume's book, Excusing Sinners, Blaming God. I got Tempe's book, Sourcehood, the second edition of it. I've gotten Michael Preciado's book, A Reformed View of Freedom. And bro, I am like a kid in a candy store, okay, just trying to soak up all this material at once. And so what we've done in the past, we've invited Colton on, like I said, as well as Chris Date and a bunch of Reformed guys, to just kind of lay out their positions. What we've done in the past is ask clarifying questions about some of the things that they bring up during those shows, just to probe a little deeper. And guys, our audience seems to really, really like that concept of, instead of debating the subject, probing the sides and explaining to make as clear as possible. And it's a tactic that I found that works really, really well. And I just like it. I like learning about stuff. Josh had mentioned something to me a while ago about there's really two steps to this. You can know something, you can understand something before you reject it or anything like that, right? But that first step is to understanding. And so whenever we brought Dr. Tim Stratton on, Colton, Chris Date, all these guys, that is my goal, is to understand their position as clear as I can before making a determination of whether to throw it out completely or whether to hang on to it. Now, granted, in the past, I have said I have thrown out determinism and I'm holding to libertarian free will. That still reigns true. But I will say this, the conversations that Colton I have had either on air or off air has really opened me up to the fact that I did not, and I'll say this without any kind of apology whatsoever, I did not understand these concepts in the way that I thought I did before. And so, Colton, I am extremely grateful for you to come back on and to lay these out for me again. And brother, Josh, is there anything that you want to add to that, or did I cover it about all?
Just that clarity is king, and it's better to know and understand before ever saying I disagree. It's better.
Amen.
Yeah, it'll save us a lot of controversy, a lot of headache, if we just ask questions before giving the nuh-uh. Like I don't find that to be terribly helpful. So I think it's good to be able to have people who are not only eager and willing, but also experienced enough to say something worth saying. I just want to encourage everybody who's listening, who has made up their mind on this topic. Assume the person you're talking to has something worth listening to, and you'll learn something. I promise.
So you're saying I've been doing it wrong this whole time?
Darn. Now there's always room for learning, buddy. There's always room to learn and improve. Okay, so what we have done so we don't keep everybody waiting. So what Colton and I and Josh and Dell, we've all agreed to do is we're going to pull up the most recent conversation that we've had with Tim Stratton on this subject. I'm getting ready to share my screen. Colton has given us a list of timestamps that we want to go through, that he wants to clarify maybe some misunderstandings, some things that I had said about the Calvinist position that might be wrong, and to really, like I said, just clarify this position as much as we can. And so I know I'm going to have questions, but Colton, is there anything that you want to add before we get started on this?
No, I kind of would like to add that I think the understanding that clarity is king is really what kind of led me into this free will debacle, I guess.
Yeah.
I didn't ever, years ago, when I first read Bignon's book, I actually first read Platinga's book, God, Freedom, and Evil. And I wasn't convinced with the libertarian. I liked the model, but I wasn't convinced of the libertarian dogma that he assumed in that book. So I read Bignon's book. and it just opened up so many doors. And I thought, okay, I'll just read, one more book.
Nope.
And then I think I could settle, that I'm a Calvinist, compatibilist, whatever. And it did not. And ironically, I read another compatibilist book. It was actually John Martin Fisher's and Mark Revisa's Responsibility and Control book that I read after Bignon's like 43 years ago. And that continued pushing me into understanding this a little bit more. And now I don't know, I just consider myself a free will guy, I suppose. Nothing else really interests me. So all that to say is I believe it, clarity is king, and that's what's really gotten me down this rabbit trail. So
Amen. It's never a bad way to go, is to be clear and really try to understand, like I said, these concepts. Because y'all, I will say this, and then we'll get started on this video, that I really did, man. I really thought I had a lot of it figured out, and come to realize like I'd only reached the tip of the iceberg. This goes so deep into just explain just even the differences within the compatibilist and the incompatibilist camp. How there's just so many subcategories. Oh my goodness, you could go on for a lifetime. I really think you could, studying all the material that's out there. And so with that being said, y'all buckle up and get ready. We are jumping into this. So let me share my screen real quick. And then Colton, I know the first timestamp was 1 hour and 2 minutes and 45 seconds in. So let me share my screen and we will get started. Maybe. Here we go.
Then necessitating determination, or even, I would say, force. People want to say it's not force. We're not forced against our will. That's not what. There's multiple definitions of force, and if someone or something else necessitates you to think a certain way, we can say you were forced to think a certain way. Yep. I know Calvinists hate it when we use the word force, but we're completely justified to use that word. And then they say, well, it's not like they're putting a gun to our head. That's a different meaning. All right. That's James White did that to me in our debate. I'm like, oh, that's not what I'm talking about, bro. But anyway, yeah, good question, Dale.
Awesome. I fully agree with your answer. So, yeah.
Did you say go ahead and pause it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So here I kind of agree that there's different definitions of force. But the problem is he asserts that determinism and force are essentially synonymous and equivalent without argument. It's just, to me, it's just straight blatantly question begging. He's assuming that if someone is determined, it's therefore forced. But why? Why would we believe that determinism is forced unless it was already a prior commitment to something like incompatibilism to suggest and probe our ideas? Well, I don't have alternative possibilities, so therefore I'm forced. But the idea is, the question at hand is to ask whether or not determinism actually precludes that kind of free will or moral, or what Stratton says, rational responsibility. But he's coming to the debate with his presuppositions loaded, saying that forcefulness equals determinism, and then he's concluding that premise as its actual conclusion. That's just question begging. But to kind of make my point a little bit more clear, I don't know of any free will philosopher that actually has that definition. He says there's multiple definitions of force. Okay, so then, absent of an argument, who says that determinism does equal force? When I read the free will literature, I'll point out three incompatibilists who don't even believe in determinism that say otherwise. The first one is probably the chief libertarian, is Robert Cain. In his book, A Contemporary Introduction to Free Will, on page 118, or sorry, not 118, but 18, page 18, he gives a number of reasons why one shouldn't confuse determinism with other things. So he says, I quote, "People believe determinism is a threat to freedom because they commonly confuse determinism with a host of other things that are a threat to freedom. But determinism does not necessarily imply other threatening things, according to compatibilists. For example, they say, number one, in quotes, don't confuse determinism with constraint, coercion, or compulsion. Freedom is the opposite of constraint, coercion, or compulsion, but it is not the opposite of determinism. Constraint, coercion, and compulsion act against our wills, preventing us from doing or choosing what we want. By contrast, determinism does not necessarily act against our wills, nor does it always prevent us from doing what we want. Causal determinism, to be sure, does mean that all events follow from earlier events in accordance with invariable laws of nature, or we can insert God's decree, as Calvinists usually contend. But compatibilists say it is a mistake to think that the laws of nature actually constrain us. So, yes, Stratton's right. Determinism means necessity. But where's the argument that the very definition of necessitating antecedent events, necessitating you to do what you do, and that you don't have the ability to do otherwise, how does that get us to I am forced to do what I do, what I'm determined to do? Kane goes on to say that because one could say, well, he's just describing the compatibilist view. It's an introductory book. He's just describing the compatibilist view. He doesn't actually believe that. No, a few pages later on page 21 to 22, he does say that it's worth noting in conclusion that classical compatibilists do seem to be right about certain things. Namely, they seem to be right, for example, in saying determinism in and of itself does not imply constraint. And he even adds fatalism there. And a lot of online communities, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I get charged with, oh, Calvinist determinism is just equivalent to fatalism. I don't think Stratton himself has made that claim, although I think he's dabbled with it a few times in his book, but I don't think he's ever made that strong claim there. But that, to me, pretty much nails it in the coffin. But Kane's not the only one. Peter Van Inwagen have also said it on a paper, and I think published in 1998, I believe. And Kadri Vivellen, awesome compatibilist, leeway compatibilist, she uses the quote to argue for her own dispositional leeway compatibilism in Causes, Laws, and Free Will. Her book is in 2013. That quote from Van Inwagen is on page 194 to 195. Peter Van Inwagen says this: "It is evident that determinism places me under no constraints. It is certainly not inevitable that my will encounter an obstacle on any given occasion in a deterministic world, and even in an indeterministic world, my will must encounter obstacles on many occasions." Finally, Kevin Tempe, a source incompatibilist, says the truth of determinism would not mean that our volitions, desires, beliefs, values, etc. play no causal role in explaining our actions. By the way, this is a ding against Stratton's passive cog idea that we have no causal roles in our actions if determinism is true. Well, Kevin Tempe thinks that that's not the case. He goes on to say, of course, if determinism is true, then our choices are themselves causally necessitated by earlier factors in a way that one might think threatens free will. He grants that because that just is the definition of determinism. Fine. But he continues, the worry that determinism rules out the causal efficiency of our volitions is misguided. Another typical initial confusion regarding compatibilism is to think that if determinism is true, then causal processes which bring about our volitions are constrained or coerced in a way that undermines our freedom. But determinism does not imply that causal processes which result from our own volitions act contrary to our own wills. Instead, it says that they are a necessary causal contributor to the volition in question once the central compatibilist claim is understood, clarified, to imply neither fatalism or constraint. And I'm going to add in force there because we usually like to think of force as constraint or coercion. Tempe says at least some of the initial resistance to compatibilism should be avoided. He says that in his 2012 book, Free Will, Source and its Sourcehood and Its Alternatives, second edition, pages 19 through 20. So where's the argument? Where does he get this idea that, oh, there's different definitions of source, so we can just simply say, but the problem is nowhere, at least from where I can tell, nowhere in the incompatibilist literature, the state of the art, the best that incompatibilists can offer, these authors, these professionals in their field, do not think that this is the case. So if Stratton wants to compel compatibilists here, I highly recommend he looks to the professionals who have argued and have compiled published works against determinism and against compatibilism and use their arguments and not these silly rhetorical arguments like forcefulness entails determinism or vice versa. One last thing, and this is from my volume 2.
Yeah.
Fisher, awesome compatibilist, probably the most well-known compatibilist in the world today. He says virtually the same thing in his The Metaphysics of Free Will book on page 19. He says that one's lack of alternatives does not manifest itself in explicit coercion. And then I say, nor does it entail for the compatibilists, quote from Fisher, that we would not be morally responsible agents, that we would just be like puppets or individuals subject to manipulation or hypnosis. Fisher says, I think it is a mistake to hastily conclude that if, say, causal determinism were to obtain, we would relevantly be similar to puppets and individuals subject to hypnosis, manipulation, or forcefulness. So, given guidance control from what I've defended, or at least exposited the last time I was on this episode, it is not at all obvious, I think, whether agents are forced to do what they do just because they couldn't do otherwise. That has not been shown.
Josh?
Okay, so then I would ask, what, in terms of the word force, I think the intuition that we would normally attach to that is a more plain use of the word rather than a philosophical use of the word. So can I ask, if, because it seems like the quotes that you read, if I'm understanding them correctly, is God doesn't put a doorway with a door closed between you and what you want. You're able to do what you want, right?
Can I just add on to what Josh is asking? So like, yeah, this is about definitions, and you use this word force, constraint,
Right.
obstacle, and I think you differentiate that to determinism. So like, can you define like what do you think the definition is, and maybe just explain like why is that the normative definition in your view?
Right. I would say forcefulness does not necessarily mean I couldn't do otherwise. And I think that's what Stratton right here is trying to argue, or at least smuggle in. I think that forcefulness entails something like I couldn't do otherwise in a certain sense, but it's not equivalent. And the reason why is because to me it's just an undistributed middle fallacy, because there's other things that we commonly understood to be synonymous with force other than the fact that I couldn't do otherwise, namely coercion, compulsion, or constraint. If I'm constrained to do something, yes, it does follow I couldn't do otherwise, right? But you can't commit an undistributed middle fallacy and just equivalent that to determinism. Oh, well, determinism I couldn't do otherwise, and with forcefulness it implies that I couldn't do otherwise, so therefore those things are the same. That's an undistributed middle fallacy, because the relevant difference is that determinism, as Tempe said, which I would remind listeners that he's an incompatibilist, an indeterminist incompatibilist, he says that determinism does not necessarily, if properly understood, does not get rid of our causal role in the causal sequence. That we do have a role, our volitions, our reasons, moderate reasons, responsiveness, all that plays a part in my action. Okay, so the only way that you can get that forcefulness and determinism are essentially relevantly similar is if you make the undistributed middle fallacy and just say, well, I'm going to not give all of those conditions the causal role that the agent has in the causal sequence. If determinism is or if compatibilism is true, I'm not going to give that to them. I'm going to get that out. But then that's when you fall into the question begging, because then why should you make an internal critique of determinism, which it is an internal critique against compatibilist determinism, but yet not use premises that we would accept? So that means you're doing a false internal critique by picking and choosing which things you want from our premises, namely, I couldn't do otherwise, but yet negating all the other ones that would show the relevant difference, namely the causal roles of the agent in the secondary causation with the causal chain. Compatibilists will say those matter to moral responsibility and freedom. It doesn't matter what the indeterminist thinks at this moment. If they're doing an internal critique, you have to assume the premises of the opponent. Otherwise, you're just question begging. I know it may have just been a flippant comment from Stratton when you guys were interviewing him, and I grant that, but he also says it all the time because I'm his biggest fan, right? So that means he says it in his book. He says it in his Rejoinder to Mignon, and I have a whole section in volume 2 called Passive Cogs, wrapping up everything and how forcefulness doesn't or is not synonymous with determinism. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, if that gives you a nice knit.
So let me ask just to make sure I understand. You're saying that the word force for you connotes something physical and external, stopping you from executing the thing that you were determined to will.
Yeah, I think it's more of like a constraint. It's like a stopping you.
So like metaphysical handcuffs.
Yeah. So I think in the literature, Vivellen actually, which is why she quotes Van Inwagen here to prove her point. There's these things called metaphysical masks and finks. They're basically these kind of like metaphysical handcuffs. They're basically like they're handcuffing you to activate a certain disposition or a certain activity. And if those are present, then you are forced to do what you do. What she tries to show is those aren't present with determinism. So therefore, you are not forced to do what you do, and you can still have free will if determinism is true. That's what she tries to argue. I would say something similar to here. Does that answer your question?
So I think I understand when you say, because again, I'm trying not to offer objections as much as possible. So I'm trying to phrase this in the form of a question. In terms of all the antecedent conditions, as in all of the things that come before my decision to do X, all of those things necessitate my doing X, which means they also necessitate my desire to do X, right?
Right.
Okay. So then I think that's what the word force is attached to, if I'm understanding Tim correctly, is the fact that your will and your desires are not in any sense detached from the causal chain. They're embedded within the causal chain, and they're not separate. There's something that's also part of that. And so I think it's the lack of independence that he's using the word force for. It's the elimination of alternate options that I think he's attaching the word force to. But I'm curious. Would it be accurate to say that your will or your desires are something that are in some sense attached directly to influences, as in influences have a causal role?
I think compatibilists are going to differ here. I'm okay with saying that influences have a causal role, but I don't want anyone hopping on that one line and just trying to show me that's wrong, because I don't really care whether or not influences have a causal role. I am more of the semi-compatibilist route, whereas I'm moderately reasons responsive and I own my mechanism, which we're going to get into source in a bit. But I understand, and I think you hit it right on the money, Josh. I think that's what Stratton is trying to say. So I agree with that. But even regardless of that, I still think it's question begging, because he's not assuming, he's not doing a proper internal critique of let me back up. Let's just say my desires that you say are actually in the causal sequence. The compatibilist is just going to say, right, but there's certain causal mechanisms that do negate my freedom, and then there's other causal mechanisms that don't negate my freedom. Not
Can
all
you give an
causes
example of one that would negate freedom? What's an example of one that would negate freedom?
that would?
Yeah.
Manipulation or hypnosis. So like what John Martin Fisher says, we would not be morally responsible agents. We would just be like puppets and individuals subject to manipulation or hypnosis. But he then says that that is not equivalent to determinism, because all determinism means is that you couldn't do otherwise. Yes, that are the antecedent conditions necessitated that you do A and rather than B or not A, right? But the idea of forcefulness has more of a positive connotation rather than a negative. So determinism, I think, if I'm going to read Fisher correctly here, has a kind of a negative connotation in the sense that all it says is I couldn't do otherwise. So I could not do otherwise. That's the negative portion. And that I only could do this. But I think forcefulness has more of a metaphysical positive thing. Like, yes, it does entail I could only do this and I couldn't do otherwise. But it also has metaphysical barriers attached to the word, I think intuitively and commonly understood, namely that constraint and that coercion. And so in order to make the argument that determinism is either synonymous to forcefulness or analogous to forcefulness, you have to be able to argue in order to argue that analogy, you have to be able to say that there's no relevant difference. But there is a relevant difference to the compatibilist, namely our desires leading to the action. And our desires were not constrained to us. In some sense, I think to go back to your earlier comment, you could do what you wanted, but you did what you wanted because you had reasons to do what you wanted, if I'm going to defend guidance control here. And that is all that's necessary for free will and moral responsibility, the compatibilist contends. So I don't know if that satisfies you, probably not. But
I think it answers my question. I think it answers my question sufficiently. Like I said, I'm trying to avoid objection. So all we want to do is bring clarity. Since Tim's not here, I'm trying to avoid the reference to Tim or his arguments necessarily, and just kind of draw out the subject or the content of what you're saying. It seems like I'm understanding you correctly when you say it's not force because there's no metaphysical handcuffs tying me to this thing externally. Internally, I experience this will desiring this thing, which then provides a reason for me to execute the desire of my will. Am I following?
I think that's fine. I think that's fair.
Okay. So then is there any instance of something internal that would be a coercion or a manipulation that would remove your will?
Right. And so that gets into really difficult metaphysics, which I don't necessarily want to get
No, that's okay. I don't want to sidetrack, so that's fine.
It would be just what I mentioned already, Vivellen's Masks and Finks. So I'll just give the resource and then we can move on. But in Causes, Laws, and Free Will, her 2013 book, she tried to defend a compatibilist leeway position. So leeway just means alternative possibilities, where she's not forced to do what she does if determinism is true. And she argues that there could be a metaphysical handcuff, namely masks and finks, to prevent her to do what she wants to do, or to prevent her to do otherwise, alternative possibilities. And then she just argues that these masks and finks are not a problem. So that's as much as I want to get into it. It's very complicated. But if you're intrigued, then I guess you can read that.
Fair enough.
Right on. So I would like to ask a couple questions. So Colton, you had mentioned that and correct me if I word this wrong, but basically an improper internal critique was given or was not even attempted.
So I think Stratton gave an improper internal critique.
Okay.
So he was. Does that clarify it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'm just curious, what would a proper internal critique look like?
Right. So great question. So a proper internal critique would be, I take an internal critique to be just a reductio ad absurdum, showing them, that your view leads to absurdity. So in this case, your view, determinism, leads to absurdity, forcefulness. So we should reject that. That's kind of the argument that they're trying to press here. And a proper internal critique would be a proper reductio ad absurdum. So whatever I can't think of one off the top of my head, but whatever reductio ad absurdum you can think of to just this leads to absurdity, then that would be where I would go. And if you study the logic, usually you do want to assume the premises of your interlocutor, the thing that you're arguing against. I actually just thought of it. The evolutionary argument against naturalism is a great, I I think, reductio ad absurdum. I'm going to refrain from my own personal views on the argument, because I know Stratton himself has used the evolutionary argument to kind of modify his free thinking argument. That's for a different story. But the evolutionary argument is supposed to be a reductio ad absurdum, namely saying if we take naturalism, evolutionary naturalism at its finest, it follows that you could not think, that you basically could not think the way that you do, and truth is not the most important. I'm generalizing hardcore, but that's
Yeah.
generally what Platinga tries to argue, something similar to those lines. That would be a reductio. Whether or not it's proper or improper is a different podcast episode, but that's what it would look like. He obviously thinks it's proper. People disagree. So reductio ad absurdums are very, very tricky arguments, because you have to be able to keep all your ducks in a row. I don't think in this case Stratton does a good job doing it.
Okay, fair enough. So is there, just out of curiosity, has there been an incompatibilist that has offered a reductio in regards to this topic that you're
Yeah.
like, that makes me scratch my head a little
Fantastic
bit? Or,
question. Yes.
okay. Okay.
Dirk Perryboom's manipulation argument, four-case
Okay.
manipulation argument, is an amazing reductio ad absurdum argument against compatibilism. I
Okay.
obviously disagree with it because I'm
Sure.
a compatibilist, and I have those reasons in volume 1 of my underneath manipulation arguments. I kind of follow similar to what Bignon does. Bignon also responds to it there, and Preciado does a little bit in his appendix in his book.
Okay.
But pretty much all compatibilists respond to manipulation arguments nowadays because they're just so prevalent, partly due to Dirk Perryboom's four-case. It's a very, very prominent argument, so you can look at it, just Google Perryboom's four-case manipulation argument, pretty much come up quickly. I think that is one that makes me kind of scratch my head sometimes, when I first learned it at least. But the primary piece of that argument is that it assumes compatibilism. And then it shows that given compatibilist conditions like guidance control and other compatibilists, like Frankfurt's hierarchical model of second order desires, if we assume all this to be true, it still seems like you are not morally responsible, the agent in the argument. And so that's how Dirk Perryboom tries to argue that compatibilism is not the type of free will that we should be looking after. Again, think it's a good argument. I disagree with it. I'll table my reasons for disagreeing with it, but I think that is what Stratton should be looking towards if he's going to go after internal critiques.
Fair enough. So manipulation arguments, check off that one. All right, I will develop them further later. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay, so one more thing, and then I'll hand it over to Dell. So, and I forget exactly the way you worded it, but you had mentioned a fallacy a few moments ago.
Right.
Okay. Can you restate what that fallacy was?
Right. So it's an undistributed middle fallacy.
Undistributed middle. Okay.
So it basically takes two things, two relations together, and it says that one is the other, or the other is the one, or whatever, or one entails the other. But you're not taking the whole entire piece of the thing. So you're leaving a piece out, and then you're saying, oh, they're equivalent. But you're undistributing that piece that's supposed to be in there. That's why it's that middle piece that you're taking out to make the argument. The same fallacy goes to the puppets argument against determinism. And this isn't new to me. Bignon has also in his book described what the undistributed middle fallacy is. I'm just applying it to determinism being analogous to forcefulness in this. He, in his second chapter, is all about coercion, excusing sinners, blaming God. Guillaume Bignon, in his book, 2018 book, I think, second chapter, he has a whole chapter on coercion. So he doesn't quite use the word force, but I think it's very similar. And whatever he says there, I'm just going to respond in the exact same way. And he does say it's an undistributed middle fallacy, and that the analogy does not work for several reasons that he lays out there.
You know what's interesting? His book is actually on sale, and it might not be on sale. It might just be the Kindle price for his book all the time, but $2.99, y'all, for the Kindle version on Amazon, and I just bought it today, and so I haven't had a chance to dive into it yet because I'm currently going through Tempe's work on Source of the second edition, and that one was a little bit more expensive, but I saw that today, $2.99. I was like, I have to get it, so I'll post a link in the description if anybody is interested in that, and then you can check that out and buy it. I mean, you can't beat $2.99. But Colton, the reason I ask you about that, the fallacy, so the undistributed
Right.
middle fallacy, right? I'm curious, would this question fall into that category? And if so, I'll erase it forever and never ever bring it up again. But I've got this wrote down. I'm just curious about your thoughts on it. So I was going through your notes a while ago, and I had wrote down this. I'm just curious what you think about it. So I said, I noticed that the language of constraint has been used quite a lot, and that the claim that using it to describe determinism is erroneous. But given that the Westminster Confession of Faith says in chapter 3.1, God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. And again in chapter 5.2, quote, although in relation to the foreknowledge and decree of God, the first cause, all things come to pass immutably and infallibly, yet by the same providence he ordereth them to fall out according to the nature of second causes, either necessarily, freely, or contingently. My question is, how exactly is God, via his decree, not limiting or constraining us from only thinking, acting, and doing in the way that which has been decreed and nothing else? So since Calvinists deny PAP, wouldn't it be appropriate to at least use the term limit, in that there is a limit from our perspective to think, act, and do only in the way which God has decreed?
Right.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't necessarily mind using the word limit.
Okay.
If determinism is true, then we are limited, I guess, to do one thing, whatever God has decreed.
Sure.
And I don't mind saying that, but all you're saying there is that determinism is determinism, that's what it means. You're just reciting the definition.
Okay.
In order to go further, to argue that it therefore entails um, an inappropriate connotation that leads to absurdity, like coercion, forcefulness, or compulsion,
Sure.
then you have to, I think, argue by analogy or some sort of, because I don't think it's not clear that's logically entailed by one or the other. So I think the best bet is for the incompatibilists to argue by analogy, that they're just analogous together, determinism and forcefulness. But then, as I said, once you do that, you're going to either question beg because you're doing a wrong internal critique, or you're just going to commit the undistributed middle fallacy, or worse, both.
Right.
So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. Dale, anything that you would like to add before we move on to the second timestamp? We're 10 till an hour, and we've only been through one timestamp. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think
It was
you
pretty
guys are
big, so the other ones can go like a lot faster. But yeah.
okay, fair enough, because I know that was an important one. So, all right, Dale, anything else?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think we've kind of covered it. Like this first clip was really just the main thing is about the definitions of forcefulness versus determinism, and the fact that we were kind of equating the two. Colton, the only thing I'm not sure if I maybe missed it, but like, how did you did you address how your definition of forcefulness is the normative definition at all, or did you just kind of say like the one that he hasn't established his definition as normative? Or
My normative definition is just force entails threats, constraints, or compulsion. It also could entail not being able to do otherwise in a relevant sense, right? But it also, I think, entails coercion, compulsion, and constraint. Those 3 C's. I think that's what force entails. And I think that's more intuitive than just saying, well, force entails that you couldn't do otherwise. So
Gotcha.
I think that's what Stratton is trying to argue here. Well, it's necessitated, so I couldn't do otherwise. So it's analogous to determinism, right? Yeah, but there's more to force than that. And I think intuitively, commonsensically, we can say that there's more than force. I'm constrained in a certain sense against my will. And I don't think compatibilists will ever say that. In fact, they have vehemently gone on record to say that determinism doesn't go against my will. And like I said, just a reminder, incompatibilists have agreed. So I think they don't have any fish to fry here. I think we should concede the argument. There's better ways to argue against compatibilism. That is not one of them.
Gotcha. Perfect. Cool. On to the next clip.
All right, we're at the 1 hour and 10-minute timestamp. What God determines outside of space-time that they would indeed experience. And that's just my initial thoughts on this entire thing. Tim, what do you think?
Well, with all due respect, Colton completely misses the point of the argument that J.P. Moreland and I have advanced in the literature. This is also why I have to continually, and JP agrees here, and Dr. Craig does as well. He uses universal instead of exhaustive. But this is why JP and I say, look, we've got to continue to use the E of ed, that exhaustive divine determinism, and shine a big, bright spotlight on the exhaustive nature of, I mean, if they try, it seems like they try to steal from libertarian freedom to argue against libertarian freedom. And that's why I say, no, this is exhaustive.
Okay. So there's a couple things here. So first of all, I don't know how I missed the point of the FTA. I've written like 250 pages on it. And he hasn't for volume 2 specifically, he hasn't responded to volume 2, at least not to my knowledge, and he's not going to read it. So I would like to see Dr. Stratton respectively point out specifically how I missed the point of the FTA. But I think here's why he thinks I missed the point of the FTA, namely because he thinks that I'm smuggling in libertarian words or libertarian vocab words. But the problem is, why is it the case that libertarians just have a monopoly on such words? Where's the argument for that? Why do they just get to use words like choice, I, source? Why is that the case? Well, presumably he could say that, well, it's because I'm determined. If you're determined, you can't choose. Well, how does that follow? If God determines me to choose X, then I choose X. You know what doesn't follow? That I didn't choose X. What follows is that I actually chose X if God determined me to choose X. So I can use words like choice. It's just the fact that my choice has been determined. But so what? Well, you don't have alternative possibilities. Well, I could have alternative possibilities if I'm a leeway compatibilist. It's just not the case that they're categorical like the indeterminist. Why does that matter? None of this he actually tells us. He just says it. And this kind of response, that this idea of, well, you're stealing from libertarian language, is honestly presuppositional. And by that, I mean it's a transcendental argument. He's transcendentally arguing for libertarian freedom by saying that we can't use, determinist compatibilists cannot use those specific buzzwords that are supposed to be belonging to libertarian freedom or libertarian free thinklings, as he would call them. But the idea is, why? Why is it the case that you should treat this argument presuppositional? And now he could say, well, it's not actually presuppositional, but let me just give a scenario and you guys can judge for yourself. Yeah. We all know presuppositionalists when it comes to classical apologetics and just apologetics in general. Now, let's just say, I don't know, Cy 10 Brukenkate goes up to Penn Jillette on the street and says, you know God exists. you know he exists, right? You hate him. You should repent of your sin. What does Penn say? If you've watched the video that I'm referring to, Penn says, I do not know that God exists. I don't think he exists, and I don't hate it. I don't hate him. I just don't think he is like, I just don't think he exists. But I don't know him. Like you say that I know him. The issue is, Cy is trying to get into Penn's psyche and say that he actually knows something when Penn himself does not. This, I think, is exactly synonymous to what Stratton is doing here. He's saying, to my knowledge, that determinists don't have access to choice words or I or choose or alternatives or whatever, simply because the very usage of them implies libertarian freedom. But I don't see how that works. I'm not a presuppositionalist with regards to apologetics, and I don't like the presuppositionalist argument to begin with. You know why? It's question begging. So why is it the case? Where's the argument to literally just say libertarians can only use words like choice, alternatives, and I? Why can't determinism use it? And if you're like, well, you're not the source under determinism. Right. I'm not the ultimate source under determinism, but that doesn't mean I'm not a source in general. Where's the argument against that? And so to me, guidance control is a compatibilist theory that says it does not matter if determinism is true or not. And so I'm going to read this quote from Carolina Sartario. And she has it published on page 87 and 88 in her new book, 2021 book, Do We Have Free Will? A Debate. It's co-authored with Robert Kane. She says this: compatibilism doesn't say that determinism is true, but only that it wouldn't undermine our free will if it were true. Thus, according to compatibilism, even if we may not know whether or not determinism holds, we needn't worry about it being true because it is not a threat to our free will. As a result, compatibilism represents a more optimistic stance on free will, which I agree, compared to incompatibilism, in that it understands free will as compatible with a way of conceiving the causal structure of the world that may, for all we know, be an accurate description of all the things the way they actually are, so determinism. And she says, to be clear, the compatibilist view doesn't require deterministic causal histories. For all the view says, there could be some connections in the causal histories of our acts that are not deterministic but indeterministic, but the view also doesn't rule out possibilities of deterministic causal histories. And the idea is, I know Stratton's trying to argue against Ed, right? But if anyone follows what I've written on the subject or on my podcasts I've done, I'm more of a compatibilist than I am an Ed advocate. Yes, I believe God determined all things, but I'm always going to defend compatibilism before I defend Ed. And the reason why is because I think it's a better picture of free will agency than incompatibilists. All that to say is, guidance control is a compatibilist theory that incorporates sourcehood, which we're going to see in a bit, and also incorporates agency, and it does not matter if determinism is true or not. And I think that's what Stratton is missing here.
And so just to be clear, and that's because guidance control is compatible with compatibilism or incompatibilism. Is that accurate, Colton?
Indeterminism or determinism.
Okay.
So
okay.
Guidance control is a compatibilist theory, and it would be compatible with indeterminism and determinism. So if it ended up being true, great. Like if determinism ended up being true, great. We don't have to hang our, as John Martin Fisher puts it, we don't have to hang our free will and moral responsibility on a thread. So let's just say we get to heaven, and then if you're an incompatibilist and you find out determinism were true, you have to be able to say, to be consistent with your views, that you weren't morally responsible that whole time. But very obviously, I think based on just the intuitive data of Scripture, we want to say that we are held accountable. And so to me, I'm a compatibilist partly because I think it's more optimistic, because it doesn't matter if I get to the end of my life and God says, oh, it's actually determinism to be true. Great. I can still be morally responsible. I can still be held accountable. I can still be free. Or if he says, oh, actually, indeterminism was the correct theory, you're wrong the whole time, Colton Carlson, I'd be like, dang. But you know what? I would still be morally responsible and free, no matter what. And I think that's actually a really beautiful side argument here. But I don't think Tim is actually grasping that. So in actuality, he may think I'm missing the point of his free thinking argument. I think he misses the point of guidance control in general. So that would be my quick response.
I got you. Yeah, because even Tempe, and what I did get to in his book, actually gave props to John Martin Fisher about that very thing that you just described. That at the end of the day, if being a compatibilist, right, you get to heaven, you find out, either way it's true. You can still say I'm morally responsible. But if you're a libertarian, at the end of the day, and determinism is true, you either have to not be consistent or give up moral responsibility or incompatibilism at that point. So I understand exactly what you're saying there, Colton. So, all right, let's go in reverse order this time. Dale, is there anything that you would like to?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So I know, like Josh and Tyler mentioned, like we're not focusing so much on Tim. It's mostly about Colton's views here. But
Right.
one thing that was brought up is about this issue of, compatibilists are borrowing from libertarian free will, and is this kind of deceptive or whatever? So it's about the word choice, I think, is what we're talking about here, for example, right? One thing I wanted to point to you, Colton, and just ask about. So sometimes when we use a definition in a way that's not common to most people, like when we use the word choice, perhaps most people would just assume or presuppose the libertarian sense, and maybe that's where Tim is coming from. He's kind of assuming most common people, when they hear the word choice, they're going to presuppose things. So if you have like a definition of choice that's different than that presupposition, the onus is on you to define it, the difference or something like that. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe that's where he's coming from with the presupposing. I don't know.
I would reject that the onus is on me, but I'll accept it for right now, because I think that he still needs to prove that to be the case, whether or not he says libertarianism is the intuitive view, which sometimes he does. I have a whole section of it on my volume 2 reply, which I try to argue that incompatibilism is not any more intuitive than compatibilism. Both have their downsides, both have their upsides, but you can't just come to the day with preloaded incompatibilist connotations or presuppositions. I don't think it works that way. But good question. How would I define choice? Unforced.
Gotcha.
So then it goes back to what I said earlier. If determinism doesn't necessarily mean or is analogous to forcefulness, well, then I can say, well, it is unforced in one sense, yet I can still be determined. I think the idea is choice just means alternative possibilities. But then the idea is, I'm going to push back and say, well, what does that mean? Does it mean access to alternative possibilities? Or does it mean that alternative possibilities just exist? Well, determinism can actually claim the former and not the latter. All determinism says is that I do not have access to alternative possibilities. I do not have the ability to do otherwise. But it doesn't say that I just don't have any alternative possibilities at all. That would be fatalism. Fatalism says that there's no alternative possibilities at all. Determinism is not fatalistic, as other incompatibilists have suggested in the recent literature, Kane, Van Inwagen, Tempe, whatever. And so I would say that determinism does allow for alternative possibilities, but not the ability to do otherwise. Taylor Sear also has this same exact argument in his recent 2017 article defending semi-compatibilism. It's free on academia if anyone's interested. So that's how I would respond. Choice means unforced. And I think that's compatible with determinism.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's so that kind of really my second question. I was kind of saying, I think you're right. In the previous show with Tim Stratton, we didn't really provide an argument for the requirement of regulative control versus guidance control kind of thing. So my second question, I was just gonna, okay, well, let's not beg the question with you here then. So like, what is your reasoning for thinking that guidance control is sufficient to have a free choice or something?
Right. So I think that is a big question that I'm not going to satisfactorily answer. I would just point people to John Martin Fisher and Responsibility and Control, or Preciado's book that Tyler Fowler is reading right now, namely because they develop the compatibilist theory of guidance control, how it's sufficient and necessary for moral responsibility. And they do so through a variety, many different examples, counterexamples, thought experiments, and so forth. But the basic, most intuitive way that they try to kind of, I guess, lay the foundations there is what they call actual sequence compatibilism, and that is found in Frankfurt-style examples. So in Frankfurt-style examples, in the actual sequence, I know there's so many different things about Frankfurt-style examples. It's a buzzword now, and you're thinking flickers of freedom, dilemma defense. All this. Aside from all that, okay. What they contend is in the actual sequence, Jones votes, he's uncoerced, and he does what he does. And so they take that as a model, although you don't need that to argue for guidance control. They just take it as a model to suggest, well, if that's intuitive, then let's kind of bring it over into the moral responsibility side and let's start developing this theory. Fisher also has another example called the car driving example. Well, I call it the car driving example, where you're driving left and you wanted to go left in the actual sequence. Obviously, the counterfactual intervener, the gross driver instructor, who's just like, picking his nose and watching you to whether or not you're going to turn left. If you turn left, he does nothing. If you turn right, he's going to obviously stop. In the actual sequence of events, you turn left, nothing happens. He continues to pick his nose, and then you're free. So the intuition is, yeah, you kind of did it free, right? So all that to say is that's their groundwork, I think, for arguing why guidance control is sufficient. And that is what guidance control is. Although the person in the driving example or Jones in the Frankfurt example does not have the control over his actions, that's regulative control, but he does have control of his actions. That's what guidance control is. That, I think, is a very quick, easy, awesome summary of regulative control and guidance control. I do not have control over my actions. I have control of my actions. And I think, along with Fish and Revisa and the guidance control semi-compatibilist community, that is enough. We need some sense of control. Yes.
Gotcha.
Compatibilists agree. But do we need this sense of control over my actions in order to be responsible? They argue through many, many examples. No. We just need control of my actions, and that is enough.
And I think that makes sense to me because, Colton, you and I were talking about this off of air on the phone the other night about, let's just go to the most famous, I guess, Frankfurt example is Jones and the mad scientist that puts it in his brain to vote Republican. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were telling me that it's not that Jones chooses to either vote Democrat or Republican, right? He's going to vote Democrat by his own free will, right? But it's how he votes. There are multiple options for how he can vote for Democrat, and that's what you're saying is the difference. It's not that he can vote Republican or Democrat; it's how he votes for Democrat.
Yes or no?
Okay.
So I don't want to go too far into the Frankfurt weeds, but
Sure.
Fisher basically says, who is the compatibilist here, he's going to say that how he votes Republican is or Democrat, whatever, that is not robust enough for proper ascriptions for moral responsibility. That's how he gets around the flicker defense. I side, oddly enough, with the incompatibilists here. And I say, no, Fisher, I get what you're trying to do here, but if you're going to use Frankfurt-style examples as a first step towards compatibilism or the first argument towards compatibilism, which is traditionally understood, then you can't beg the question. Those flickers do mean something to the incompatibilist. Bignon actually has the exact same view. And I contend that this is wholly plausible for the incompatibilist, so I don't find Frankfurt-style examples sufficient to argue against PAP or the principle of alternative possibilities. However, I do argue Frankfurt-style examples for sourcehood. I think that in the actual sequence, we do see something of a source in Jones, regardless of all the PAP flickers of freedom nonsense. Perry Boom would take this view, same thing with Tempe, and I would take it, but just put the compatibilist spin on it, and I think it does just fine.
Gotcha. Josh?
I actually kind of wanted to circle back to the initial issue with the claim that there's let's say a theft of vocabulary going on,
Okay.
or at least a misapprehension of the utility of different vocabulary. Let's say where you would have in the most colloquial normative kind of sense, when I say choice, the implication would be alternate options, or at least a selection from alternate options, the selector being myself, which does imply in a non-technical, non-scholarly way indeterminacy, which is why I think Dale's point was, without caveat, it almost seems like a theft of vocabulary in some real sense. In the same way that you were saying, Tim didn't make a caveat about his word force. So I think it's kind of this same problem, different face. You didn't like the word force because of the implication of something like metaphysical handcuffs. Tim doesn't like the utility of certain words that normally have a libertarian implication because of the lack of caveat in the same exact way. And so I think that that was really why it was the case that when he said we need to be pushing back on this, it's not because he wants to police your language. It's
Right.
because he wants the EDD thing. The exhaustive part is to literally point out what we were saying before, is that all the antecedent conditions, in other words, everything that came before, is in the causal chain to bring about the desire and your will to do so, as well as the executing of your will to do
Yeah.
so. So it's nothing going against your will, because your will is the thing that you're following. But your will also is the thing that Tim is saying is forcing you, because your will is derivative from that causal chain. And so I think that's why he's using the word force, and it's also why he's using this idea that the language needs to be qualified better for the clarity of people who haven't read all of these books, right? Because most people who are on the internet who are discussing these things and utilizing these words, and even Tyler is included in this category years ago, where compatibilism meant that I'm not a determinist, right? Like
Right.
it's very difficult sometimes to make those qualifiers, and people will not simply listen to the libertarian side if we say you can't just use that word and expect that I'm not going to check you on the vocabulary. I think that's what Tim was saying, but I think that the reason why I say that is because of our aim at clarity here, is that we're now providing that caveat. You're not saying that when you use the word choice, you mean the same thing as what a libertarian would say. And so I think that's probably why it needs those caveats, is because we're using the same words, but not for the same thing, right? So it's not necessarily that you don't have access to that vocabulary. It's that access to that vocabulary requires further caveat. As in, if Tim were to say, necessity is force, and you'd say that needs more qualifiers, that's not sufficient, right? I think that he's saying the same thing about libertarian implications out of those words. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense, and I would tentatively agree that I think we just need to be more clear with the words that we use. I do not. I will say that I think Calvinist theologians are notoriously. Uh, they do not do this well. They do not do this well. I think Sproul and James White is part of the problem. Personally, I hate to call them out. One
Yeah.
that's late and one that's still actively alive. But I think they are part of the problem because they don't do the hard lifting of philosophy. I'm not the kind of guy, and you can ask anybody who knows me well, especially my wife. I don't necessarily take the intuitive or commonsensical view all the time because I always want to challenge it. Like, I get that choice may intuitively mean I have access to alternative options, or that force means I could not do otherwise. I understand that. I think, though, that there, as what you're saying, there's more to that word than even the dictionary gives, because guess what? The dictionary is not a philosophical textbook. And so I think, and I also believe philosophically words are fluid and we change the meaning of words over time. Just like gay, we change the word of that meaning over time. Whether that's wrong is a different question, but the idea is, with philosophy, I think we change meanings of words, choice, force. All we can do, and I agree with you, Josh, all we can do is be as clear as possible when we use those words. I don't mind necessarily him saying, oh, you can't use that word. Okay, where's the argument then? That's what I'm kind of getting at. I need to see a specific internal critique of why I cannot use that word, and why the compatibilist must necessarily accept your definition of the word. Because from what I can see is, at least with choice, compatibilists can affirm alternative possibilities. They're just leeway compatibilists. So if all you care about with choice is alternative possibilities, we have it. If all you care about of choice is unforced, we have it. Depending on how you view the first timestamp we went through with forcefulness. But if what you mean by choice is access to alternative possibilities, then okay, that's when we're gonna start the match. We're gonna start rumbling, because then why does choice necessarily mean that? Um, especially in the intuitive, more commonsensical view.
I
What
think
do
it's
you just
because it is the most common view, and it is the way that it is used by the people that you mentioned who don't do a very good job of making those caveats, who in fact have a wider reach and audience than the people who are making these caveats and speaking more
yeah,
philosophically. And so
yeah,
I think it's necessary on our end, the people who are trying to make these ideas more accessible to the people who don't have the background of all that reading, all the citations that you're giving are really helpful, because of the fact that there are lots of people who do not have access to a lot of this information. And what they do have access is to the James White. They do have access to the R.C. Sproul. They do have access to these popular level apologists, popularizers, who are going to use these words in the way that we would use them, without making the caveat that that's not what they mean. And it just stands in people's minds. And so when it's being used, and again, our audience is the same audience as them. And so that's why I would say, for us, we're not writing a dissertation. It would make sense to either use a different word or caveat the word more
right,
thoroughly, to make it known that when you mean choice, you don't mean I'm the source of my decision from among
right,
available options. What you mean
right,
is I have an experience of being a will, and that will gives me a sufficient reason to follow through with what I desire. My desire is still part of the antecedent conditions. It's not disconnected in any way. It's not autonomous from the previous all the antecedent everything that came before, right?
correct,
And there's a reason why I keep saying everything that came before rather than simply using antecedent conditions. It's because when people use those words, oftentimes, like, I know that my mom is one of those people who's incredibly street smart and incredibly intuitive, but could care less about complex vocabulary.
right,
So say it to her like you mean it, rather than using the technical terms. And for us, that what we're trying to do specifically is bring that kind of clarity to these topics, which is not something that people are doing very much.
right.
And so I think that's why it's so much more helpful to either avoid using those words without caveat, or select a different word in order to represent what you mean without having to make the caveat. Do you see what I
Yeah,
mean?
I totally get what you're saying. I'm going to then use the word with the caveat, and so I think I caveated enough. If I haven't,
No, I
then
think you explained really
right.
well here. I'm just
Yeah.
saying, I think that's because you asked for an argument. I'm giving my best attempt at why it
Oh,
would be
gotcha.
necessary for that to
I
be
think you're
brought out
right.
further.
I think that makes sense.
Mhm.
I think like I said, I would side with you that specifically Calvinist theologians, all the way from like Bavinck, Botner to contemporary White and Sproul, they've just done a terrible job of doing this. And
And I
so
do
I
not
think
disagree with that. I think you're
Yeah,
right. They
I
have done
think
a pretty
Bignon is one of the Calvinists who is trying to make the philosophy as rigorous as possible, but as accessible as possible as well. And I think I follow in his tradition. I think I want to try to make it as clear as possible, caveat the words. What do we mean by this? And so we all know that, okay, when Stratton says choice, or if an incompatibilist or whoever says choice, they mean access to alternatives. Okay, great. The Calvinists, they can still use choice. They do not mean this. And then we can get rid of all of this unnecessary fluff and get to the heart of the issue. What's the argument for compatibilism or incompatibilism? And then all those other things like forcefulness, choice, all these other little issues would follow.
Yep.
And so I think that's the general MO of what the compatibilists should do here. And I would like to apologize on the Calvinist community that it's not always that case. And unfortunately, it's just not. And I am trying to, although I'll probably not succeed, I'm trying to make it better. So,
Right
a
on.
noble goal indeed.
For real. For real. So everybody out there listening, whether you're Calvinist, whether you're not, be more clear. It goes a long way, right?
Clarity is king. Yeah.
That's right.
Here,
That's
here.
right.
I think
All
we're
right.
ready for the next timestamp.
Yeah, and this is one that I actually had a part in saying, so I'm interested. in this. So we're at let me share my screen again.
While he's bringing that up, I was just gonna make a joke.
Yeah, go ahead.
Say, I already told you, man. I apologize for my argument from beauty with the complex terminology. I'll do better. Don't worry.
That was totally directed at you, Dale.
I knew it. Yeah, I can feel it.
Where are we at? 118.10. Give me just a second. What? Well, I will start here. All right.
And it starts a new causal chain because
You know,
the domino is a person.
And I'm just curious, what good does it? And Dale, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'll get back to you right after this. What good does it for us to have access, or not to have access, but to merely be aware of these things? Like, what does that do exactly in the causal chain? Nothing, according to the determinist view, right?
Well, they think that it affords the ability to say that the agent having that experience means the agent is then responsible for those reasons and for that experience.
Yeah, it's finding a way to put responsibility or take responsibility from God and put it on the person. Right. I get it. Yeah, I agree.
Well, it's the way I see it. Yeah, because they think those green dominoes are enough. And I'm sorry, I'll shut up about dominoes. I'm tired about them too much. they want to, like, look, in order to be free, you need the choice to be.
Did you say to pause it, Colton? You're muted. Sorry. Hold on. You're still muted.
Colton,
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not going to get too much into the domino thing. Sorry, Dale.
Excuse me?
So basically, to answer the question, what good does it do? Well, I think the issue have to do with necessary and sufficient conditions. So the good of being aware of reasons is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for responsibility. So while receptivity to reasons, me being aware of alternatives that are there, that's the first component of moderate reasons responsiveness, being receptive to reasons. Yes, I have to be aware of the reasons, but that's not all there is to moderate reasons responsiveness. So I agree slightly. So like if I just left it like that, Tyler, I agree with you. It does no good. We need other stuff, which is what guidance control tries to flesh out. So we must be aware of our reasons for why we do a certain action. All parties would agree, libertarian, incompatibilist, compatibilist, but that is not what grounds responsibility or freedom. That's just one small part of guidance control. So I hope that kind of clarifies it a bit for what good does it do. So
no, it definitely did, bro. And I apologize for not bringing those other two I guess elements of the argument for guidance control into the frame. And so that's on me. I did misunderstand it at that point. And what you've said, and I've went over it a couple times now in your notes, it did help me to clear it up. So the only question I really got at this point is what Josh and David kind of said there after that fact. Would you agree with sort of what they were saying, or would you rephrase it like as you did just a few moments ago?
I think I would agree. I think maybe Josh can correct me if I'm wrong. I think he's trying to phrase it in a way that boils it down to a mechanism rather than an agent-based sort of thing, where it's a mechanism just passing through me and I'm not an actual agent. I think, and I will grant that Fish and Revisa their guidance control view is a mechanism-based view. So they put responsibility on the mechanism, and then the agent is sort of passive in that. So I would agree, but McKenna has actually argued that we can make it an agent-based view, not a mechanism-based view, and then you use dispositional leeway compatibilism in order to help that view out. So that's a small thing. It's not even almost worth mentioning, but that's the only thing I would change.
Okay. Josh, since you were involved in that little clip.
I mean, I wasn't attempting to reduce anything. I was trying to answer Tyler's question, what is it good for? And I was saying, I think the intention is to say that the experience of being an agent and doing those things is being used as a reason to tie the experience of the agent and their choice making to the moral responsibility argument. That's what I wasn't trying to reduce it to just that one element any more than it had already been done. What I was trying to say is he asked, what good is the awareness? And I was saying that the awareness and the experience of making the choice is part of the reason why they would use that, is to establish that blameworthiness.
That's fine.
Right.
Totally cool.
Dale, anything else before we move on?
So no, yeah, I was going over this with Tyler this morning, kind of thing, or this afternoon, and
Yeah,
like I said, Colton's absolutely right on this point. That's why even on the show itself, I was kind of like, yeah, but there's got to be those three together that I'm saying are sufficient. Now, one thing I want to check with that, because I'm not even sure that's right, Colton. So you have the three conditions for moderate reasons responsiveness,
Right.
but you also need like three other conditions. Like what is sufficient for the freedom? Is the three conditions of moderate reasons responsiveness sufficient, or is there the other stuff as
Right.
well?
No, so there's also mechanism ownership.
Gotcha.
So mechanism ownership, the basic two conditions for guidance and control is moderate reasons responsiveness and mechanism ownership. Mechanism ownership has three conditions along with it. And those three conditions are that I have to see myself as a source. I have to be a prime aptitude, or a prime or apt candidate of reactive attitudes. And I need to base those two on evidence. And then, so that one's the easiest one, I think. And then moderate reason responsiveness gets a little sticky, because then it's receptivity to reasons, reactivity to reasons, and then those two have to be understood in an understandable way. So I'm not making whim decisions, I'm not making insane decisions. It is sort of based on the evidence. But you can go, and I didn't go into the show earlier with you guys, but there are even more sub conditions in receptivity and reactivity that are pretty intense. And so I just kind of like what Josh was saying, say how it is without any of the philosophical jargon on it. That's how I explained it to you guys as best as I possibly could. But there is a lot more specific conditions on what happens with the kind of mechanism, what kind of mechanism is operating when you're regularly receptive to reasons, all that fun junk. What does it mean? Understandable pattern in philosophical jargon. Those conditions are also attached. But to answer your question, two conditions: guidance control, moderate reasons responsiveness, and mechanism ownership. You have three for mechanism ownership, and technically, yes, three for moderate reasons responsiveness.
Cool.
Sounds like something for our part 2. Yeah.
yeah.
So this is a review of a review of a review.
Bro, I'm gonna tell you, by the end, this is all said and done. So you notice, so whenever I put this up, so check this out real quick. So you see my little, like, off to the left-hand side of the screen, there's us, and then there's us down at the bottom. We're gonna be wrapping around this whole computer screen by the time it's all said and done. I'm just saying that right now. Colt, let me ask you one more thing, because I know this has got brought up in my discussions with Tim, and I know it's got brought up in my discussions with Josh. So is there a problem? And I think I know your answer here, but I just want to ask the question, and then you elaborate on this a little bit. Is there a problem if we view ourselves as the source, but we aren't actually the source, that it only seems to be as though we are the source? Or are we an actual source in the causal chain? How would you respond to that, or do I need to be a little bit more clear?
No, I think it's good. I
Okay.
don't know if we can necessarily view ourselves as the source. So
Okay.
that may get sticky, because someone like an incompatibilist could say, like, well, you're being deceptive. You're deceiving yourself for thinking that you are actually the source when you're really not the source if determinism is true. I don't really have an answer to that, other than the fact I'm not convinced that it is indeed deceptive. All I can say is that we are just a source.
Okay.
What does it mean to be the ultimate source, the sufficient source of my action? I don't know if that's a really strong claim for me personally. I'm going to be agnostic on, even if I was an indeterminist, I would be agnostic on the side of, I'm not sure I could even ever be considered the sufficient source for all the class of things that go into my body and in my mind and so forth. And I think that is so far what the incompatibilist literature has defined ultimate sourcehood as it entails a certain sense of sufficiency. So to answer your question, I would just say that if determinism is true, we view ourselves as a source, as an instrumental source, a source in some sense. And we're going to see in the next timestamp, actually pretty much the whole video is geared towards sourceness. But if that answers your question, I think, but
Yeah, I think
this
it
makes
does.
me think of something that I think will be important in the part 2 as well, is tying this into the image of God,
right.
being made in God's image, and which parts of his image are communicable attributes, let's say,
Right.
and whether sourcehood can be one of those communicable attributes. But I digress. Carry on.
All right, guys. Dale, anything else you want to add, or are we going to get to the next timestamp? Go ahead. Okay. Let me pull up this again. And I think I'm already there. So yeah, 122:43. So Colton, do you want me to stop this at the 123:45, or do you just want me to let it play?
Yeah,
I know there's okay.
Let's stop it there.
Okay.
Interact with that one reason to do that one thing.
All right. I'm going to stop you right here, Colton. No, you don't. What makes you you is merely aware of and functioning in the way which God has determined you to. This is libertarian language that, in my humble opinion, the determinist has to borrow from to make their view even coherent. You heard what he said. I interact with one reason to do one thing. No, Colton, you just said a moments ago that you are only aware and that you don't have access to these things. So how in the world can you interact with them?
Yeah, great catch, Tyler. You know, I think it's vital as we move forward in these discussions and in these debates for libertarians to constantly call out the inappropriate use of language that's ultimately being stolen by determinists. You know, thankfully, Chris Date realizes this.
Okay. Can I just say something really quick? All right. I did not mean to come off in any kind of douchebaggery way. Okay. Like I do get a little animated sometimes, kind of like I am now. But if I came off that way, Colton, I sincerely from the bottom of my heart apologize. I did not mean to. So I just say that to preface whatever you're about to say.
Sure.
So,
no, it's all good, and we've talked already off air before,
Yeah.
and so everything's good. But to answer your question, different ideas of source. That's how I can interact. So the idea is, and I just want to say, and I know it's not about Stratton, it's just about my views in general, but I'm Stratton's biggest fan, so I can't help it. So, but he does have a rejoinder to Bignon. His 50 pages rejoinder to Bignon. Bignon has a 50-page review, and Bignon explicitly says and criticizes Stratton for this issue that Stratton doesn't use varying different sources. He doesn't take into account compatibilist senses of source. What does Stratton say in response? Nothing. He doesn't say anything in his rejoinder. He wholly skips past it. And I explain all this and I detail it and summarize it all in my volume 2. But what is the sense of source the compatibilist is looking towards? Well, theologically, I would use the authorial model of providence. What does that look like? Let me ask you just an intuitive question. Just if I'm on the street of something, does Harry Potter not interact with Voldemort? Or who killed Voldemort in Harry Potter? You would intuitively say Harry Potter.
No, yeah.
Yeah. Now you want to say perhaps J.K. Rowling. Well, J.K. Rowling is the sufficient author, so she is the sufficient source of Harry Potter killing Voldemort. Right, I agree. But who killed Voldemort? Are you going to say like J.K. Rowling every single time? No. What you're going to say is Harry Potter. That is the kind of sense of source I'm getting at. That in the story, Harry Potter is a genuine character. He does have an agency. Yes, it was determined and written by J.K. Rowling. But does he not have a character? Of course, you would say yes. Does he kill Voldemort? Yes. Does he interact with other people in the story? Yes. So in that sense of source is the same sense of source I call formal sourcehood. Theologians call it secondary causation sourcehood, instrumental sourcehood. They all mean the exact same thing. But it is that kind of source, the formal source, not the efficient source, not the ultimate source, but a secondary source that is at stake, I think, in moral responsibility and freedom. And so, yeah, he's not the ultimate source. Harry Potter is not the ultimate source. Does that mean he's not a source at all? That he didn't kill? That he didn't deliberate in the story of killing Voldemort? Of course not. It's ridiculous to me. And so, yes, I can use words like I can use words like choice, even though we're in this grand story written by God. To me, that's totally fine.
Gotcha. So instead of, and no offense, like any, toward using analogy and using like fictitious movies, right? So let me just kind of rewind a little bit just to make sure I understand the concept. So let's apply this to David, Joab, and Uriah, right? This really took place. And so what you're saying is, even though David sent Joab, told Joab, look, whenever you guys get to the front lines, you're going to pull back and leave Uriah there, right? Joab is the instrumental source in Uriah's death. Not only Joab, but who was it? They was fighting the Philistines, I think. They were an instrumental source or a formal source, or however you worded that. But anyway, you get my point. David
Right.
goes back to being the ultimate sufficient source, where Joab, the Philistines, all attributed to Uriah's death, they would be viewed as the instrumental source. So not only is David held accountable, but Joab and also the Philistines that killed Uriah is also held accountable, correct?
Yeah, I would
Okay.
say so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I was just making sure I understood. All right. Josh,
And I
anything
would,
else?
I'm
Go ahead.
sorry, I would like to add,
Yeah.
that pressing this analogy, because I see in the comments and everything, oh, well, it's not an analogous thing. Well, there's two ways to press an analogy. One relevant similarity, no relevant difference. So a lot of people like to say, well, the analogy doesn't work because it's not real. Well, then you're just pressing on no relevant, that you're insinuating that I'm insinuating the analogy has to be presented as a no relevant difference analogy.
Okay.
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there's one relevant similarity in the source, which means if you posit by saying, well, I disagree with the analogy because it's not real, what you're saying is you're wholly bypassing my relevant similarity, how I use it, and you're just saying, well, here's a relevant difference. What's the problem? It's not relevant to what I'm saying. I know it's not real. I know the analogy is, I know that the analogy is flawed in that sense, but I'm not using the analogy in that sense. So it doesn't matter if Harry Potter is fictitious or fiction or whatever. What I'm saying is that the one relevant similarity is that J.K. Rowling is the sufficient cause and the sufficient ultimate source. Harry Potter's not. God is the ultimate sufficient source. We are not. That's one relevant similarity. Now, I also say, is Harry Potter a character or an agent in the book? My intuitive response, and I think everyone's intuitive response, should be yes. So I say, one relevant similarity, why does that not apply to metaphysics with God? I think it should transfer. Intuitively, it should transfer. That's the one relevant similarity I'm pushing. So if people are saying, which I get it all the time, that no, it's not real. So what you're doing is positing a one relevant difference, but it's not relevant to my one relevant similarity. So I completely bypass it. You're not getting to the point of the analogy.
So in one sense, really, your analogy is almost better than the analogy I used, in the sense that J.K. Rowling is outside the realm of Harry Potter's reality, right? Reality. And the fact that David was in reality, in creation with Joab, and there seems to be a difference in the way. And I think Preciado argued this on either Marlon Wilson's channel or Eli Ayala's channel, about how there's a difference. So the analogy with a mob boss was brought up, right? The mob boss tells a soldier, go kill somebody. How in the world is the soldier not just as guilty as the mob boss, or vice versa, right? And I think Preciado said that I would love to get him back on the podcast to begin with, but he rejected that. But that's another story. But regardless, he said that there was a difference in the way in which God determines X to happen versus the way the mob boss determined that Joe Schmo would die, right?
Right.
Via his instrumentality, which was his soldier.
Right.
So would you agree with that, or would you phrase it a little different?
Right. I would agree, because there is a difference in intention is one reason, not the only reason, but I think
Sure.
one reason that we don't hold J.K. Rowling blameworthy for writing Voldemort killing all the people that he did. And so we don't hold her responsible. In fact, what we would say, again, pressing the one relevant similarity here, not the one that there is no relevant difference between Harry Potter and real life. I'm not
Right.
saying that. Obviously,
Right.
there's tons of relevant differences, but I'm saying in one relevant similarity here, J.K. Rowling would probably be praised in some sense. I want to tread lightly, praised in some sense for the books that she has created, for an immaculate storyline, for victory over death and evil, right? And the way
Right.
she did it is well done. I mean, she's like, what, the best-selling author of all time? And I guess analogously, God is the best-selling author of all time, right? Because he has this awesome storyline of written from Scripture and into us now, what he's doing with creation. And I think, based on the authorial model, that it preserves him being the ultimate source and us still being a source, the instrumental or formal source. And so I would like to say that that is the analogous way. So that is my response to that.
Gotcha. Josh Riddell. I know, Josh, you had asked how many more timestamps we got. We got 13. So I don't know if you guys are wanting to maybe wind down after the next couple of few and do this,
Yeah, that's fine.
finish up the rest of them as a part 2, or how we want to do this. But Colton says, yeah.
Well,
What do you guys
I
wanna do
was
first?
asking particularly because my wife was wondering when she can use her kitchen again, which is adjacent to my right here, and it would
Okay.
be a disturbance for our sound quality if she were pots and panning it up in the kitchen right now. So she was asking very politely, as she does, when she can have her kitchen back. So
I like how you worded that. And also, my wife is sick, so just as a kind of a detour, if y'all those who are watching and everybody on here, if y'all could pray for my wife. She was fine last night. She woke up really sick today, fever, and so we don't know what's going on. Hopefully it's just a bug, but if y'all could be praying for her, that would be, I know she would appreciate it, and I do too. But yeah, okay. So do we want to hit maybe one more timestamp and then wind down and then save
okay
the
with
rest
that.
for Colton? Are you good with that?
It's up to you guys. I can
Okay.
jump around and just do one episode, or
Okay.
we can come back and I can just finish up one more timestamp and then make it a part 2. It's totally up to you.
Dale, what do you
I'm the help. I'm good with whatever you guys want to do. I'll be here to help you guys out. So yeah.
You're the Matrix agent that keeps us all safe.
Yeah, I saw that in the comments, Dale.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, you've seen all the mainstream Christian apologists. They're all copying me. You got William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, you know, Thug Life. I've seen it. They're copying my style.
I love it. All right,
so-
let's do. Go ahead, Josh.
I was gonna say, Colton, if we were to choose from your 13 remaining timestamps, which one is most important to you?
Probably 155:21.
Fair enough. Okay.
All right, I will go to 155:21. Oop. Hey, 155:21. Go. Why are alternative possibilities only sufficient?
So no, I don't agree with Colton. Now, some people think that this is the case, and Colton is certainly entitled to his subjective opinion here. But as Moreland and I noted in our paper, the view that libertarian freedom necessarily requires alternative possibilities is losing popularity among some prominent philosophers today. I mean, we discuss Eleanor Stump as an example. She has described this in her essay, Moral Responsibility Without Alternative Possibilities. William Lane Craig is a philosopher some people might have heard of. Right. He is one of the leading philosophers in the world. Actually, William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland are both considered to be 2 of the top 50 most influential philosophers in the world today. And we're not just talking Christian philosophers. We're talking about top 50 philosophers in the world today.
You're number one, right, Tim?
No, never will even be
Tim's
close.
number one.
No. But Dr. Craig is clear that the libertarian does not need to affirm alternative possibilities. He says, quote, "I am explicitly a libertarian about freedom of the will, and so there should be no doubt about that. I just deny the so-called principle of alternative possibilities, that the ability to do otherwise in a given situation is a necessary condition of libertarian freedom," end quote. Right? He wrote that in an article called "I, a Compatibilist?" ? So although JP and I do argue that humans occasionally possess alternative possibilities, what we refer to as strong libertarian freedom, arguing for the weaker version of libertarian freedom is sufficient. As we argue in our essay, the free-thinking argument can be defended with or without the assumption of alternative possibilities. So look, I do think we have alternative possibilities. I argue that we do. But for the sake of argument, I can also say, well, let's suppose all those arguments fail. I can still make my point without it. So here's an argument based upon the one that we advanced in our paper, and I'm going to expand it.
So a couple things. He says, yes, he does argue for the ability to do otherwise or alternative possibilities for libertarianism. He does that many, many times. I think his specifically, I think his deliberation argument requires it, because you need to be able to weigh the pros and cons, alternatives, in order to be a deliberative agent. But that's neither here nor there. What he does say is that I think weak libertarianism is sufficient to argue for libertarianism. What does it mean by weak? Well, he just means that if indeterminism is true, namely that I am not causally determined by anything or anyone else, he concludes that just definitionally entails libertarian freedom. No, it does not. Indeterminism, by definition, does not entail libertarian freedom. And this, I find, is a very, very common mistake, even among some of the philosophers that he mentioned, like Stump. And these are what we call Frankfurt libertarians. So what I argue in volume 1 is that alternative possibilities, before we get into the Frankfurt libertarians and junk, alternative possibilities are necessary in the sense that an agent must have possessed them non-derivatively sometime in the causal chain. What does non-derivatively mean? It means at a prior instance. So that's what we call directly free or non-derivatively responsibility. So a great example of this would be a drunk driver. So drunk driver at T1, he decides to get drunk. He is directly free and non-derivatively responsible. At T2, he is drunk. At T3, he drives. He kills a kid. We still intuitively want to hold him responsible, but at T3, could he do other than swerve and hit a kid? No, he was determined based on his drunkenness at T2. So he was determined at T3 to kill the kid, but does that negate his responsibility? No, the incompatibilists would say, and I would agree, that he is still responsible because of an earlier decision at T1 deciding to get drunk. So non-derivatively, he had the alternative possibility at T1 to get drunk or not. Mm-hmm. I argue in volume 1, all libertarians must say that. All libertarians, I think, must say that alternative possibilities are somewhere residing in the causal history of the agent at non-derivative crucial moments. That's what Kane calls them, crucial self-forming active moments. And I think this is not anything new to me. I think many libertarians have argued this. So they are necessary at all times, non-derivatively. But derivatively, no, they're not necessary at all times. So what does it mean with regards to Frankfurt stuff? Because he mentioned Stump. The problem with Stump is that Stump published the article in 1996 and in 2003. Okay. Hunt is another Frankfurt libertarian. He has published a lot of articles throughout the years, most notably in 2003 in the book, this book right here, Moral Responsibility and Alternative Possibilities. So this is just a book about all sorts of fun Frankfurt style examples. But he's also published it in 2017, something very similar in Free Will and Classical Theism. What's my point? My point is Stratton is trying to say, well, the ability to do otherwise as necessary for libertarian freedom is dying out. It's not. Where does he get that idea? Most libertarians are going to argue for some sense of leeway, which is what I'm saying. Franklin, who published his book in 2000, I believe 18 or 19, he argues for a leeway account. Kane argues, the most notable libertarian philosopher, argues for a leeway account. Okay, other libertarians like Carl Janae or Whitaker argue for a leeway account. Stump, Craig, even though I don't want to include Craig because he's not a philosopher of freedom, but they are all Frankfurt libertarians. They are a minority. That is not the majority. The majority of philosophers are going to argue that leeway for libertarianism, leeway is needed non-derivatively. And I take this, along with Tempe's view, to be pretty substantial. Tempe published his book, Free Will, the second edition, in 2012. Okay. To me, his argument is pretty much like foolproof. What does he say? He says, basically, given Frankfurt-style arguments, the flicker of freedom is there, but the ability to do otherwise is so weak that it does not ground free will. And so what he does is he says, okay, source grounds free will, but that flicker of freedom is needed there. The alternative possibility is needed there. Why? So that we know we are the source. Otherwise, how would you know that you are the source if you had no alternatives? And to me, even though I'm not an incompatibilist, I find that wholly plausible. So he argues against what he calls these narrow source incompatibilists. That's what he calls the Frankfurt libertarians, or what Stratton has called the weak libertarians, or what Mealy has called the soft libertarians. Tons of stupid names that no one really cares about. But he calls them narrow source incompatibilists. And he says, Tempe says, as an incompatibilist, that we should be wide source incompatibilists. Namely, that we should see us, yes, as the source. He agrees with them, saying, yes, alternative possibilities aren't needed to ground responsibility, but they are needed to ground sourcehood, which then in turn grounds responsibility. Otherwise, how do you know if you have no alternatives whatsoever, which is what the idea Stratton is trying to get here? Philosophers like Stump, philosophers like Zagzebski, philosophers like Craig, philosophers like Hunt, they're all saying alternatives are not needed at all in the causal sequence. The problem is, how do you know that you're the source without them? And I think I just wholly buy Tempe's argument here. And so I want to push back and I say, no, you do need alternatives. I don't care if they're weak, strong, robust. You need some sort of alternatives in the causal sequence of the indeterminist causal sequence in order to know that you're the ultimate source.
By that, you mean an alternate possibility is a display of sourcehood rather than a necessary precondition for sourcehood. It is impossible to show sourcehood without an alternate possibility. Am I following?
Right. So Tempe is saying it's not possible to show sourcehood without having an alternative possibility somewhere.
But it's not impossible that you are a source without alternate possibility. It would just be impossible to display such a thing.
Right. I think that's
okay.
I don't know if he exactly says in those words, but I think if I were to speak for him, I think he would say that. He's not saying that these narrow source incompatibilists or these Frankfurt libertarians are wrong per se. He's just saying that they're misguided, that he thinks that something else is needed to strengthen the view, and that is those weak alternatives, so that we can see ourselves as a source and be a little bit more firm in our sourcehoodness. than you would otherwise be.
I think that one of the things that this conversation is sorely lacking, in my opinion, is the integration of what it means to be made in God's image. Because again, if it is a communicable attribute of God to be a source, the source, and then he makes us in his, let's say we'll use the author analogy, that he creates us in order to be co-authors in time, that it would not necessarily be necessary to display alternate possibilities in order to be a source, but in order to display that sourcehood, you would need to use an instance of alternate possibility to be a display of the sourcehood. But I don't think that it's necessary to have alternate possibilities in order to be a source. But I think that that's because I put such a heavy weight on the meaning and importance of being made in God's image, and that being the thing that makes us what we are. You know what I mean?
Right.
But yeah, I think I'm following what you were saying pretty closely. I think I understood that.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have anything else to add. I was going to ask there, but I think you clarified it, Colton. So is that how Tempe can kind of fall back into being, if he falls under a label, a source libertarian, and still hold to alternative possibilities? I think I got what you were saying is that, and this is going to be like a really dumbed down version of it for the most part. Yeah. But basically that without just what Josh said, without those alternative possibilities, not necessarily accessible, but just there, right? We wouldn't know that we're the source to begin with. And so I look forward to diving into Tempe's book more now because of this entire conversation, but especially that part, because it sounds like he really brings that out in the book. So
and
I don't have too much to say on it because I haven't been there yet. So
if I would like to add,
yeah,
I keep saying it because I honestly am convinced. I'm convicted that it's true, but I really do think I'm Stratton's biggest fan because I've pretty much read everything about it. And one of the reasons why I read Tempe so fast is because of that section that I'm articulating right now. Why? Because when I was reading back at, this is even before Stratton's book was published, like early 2020 or whatever, he had all these articles saying that PAP is sufficient for moral responsibility or whatever, but it's not necessary. Basically, he meant PAP as in alternative possibilities. It is necessary for free thinking, sometimes he says in some articles, and then other times, like in his book, he says it's just not necessary for freedom in general. And I always found that completely odd because of what Tempe says right here. And I think that it doesn't matter if it's a weak alternative or a strong alternative. You still need alternatives, I think, to know that you are the source. Not to be the source, perhaps. Maybe Tempe would say that. You need alternatives to actually be the source. He's not exactly clear on that end. But I think I would side with Josh that you can still be the source without alternatives. It's just the case that you wouldn't know that you are the source. And I think that knowing that you are the source is if I'm an incompatibilist, it's a pretty coveted thing to know, I think. I think I would want to know whether or not I am the source. And philosophically speaking, if the Frankfurt style examples do have the flickers, I would buy that argument. Now, I think there's some other issues wrong with Tempe's formulation from if I take a robust libertarian view and graph it in with his source and compatibilism view. I think there's some quibbles there. I explain it in volume 1 of my reply to Stratton, but generally I still will say that alternatives are needed for the source. And it was Stratton himself, before I even got into this whole volume 1, volume 2 mess, that kind of led me to read Tempe and to kind of read that section. So
right on. Dale, any kind of closing thoughts? And then
I kind of raised my eyebrows when I heard Tim say that too, because I am of the simplistic view. I think that the PAP of a nuanced version is necessary for freedom. I've never thought about it in relation to, well, that's how you prove you're the source and stuff like that. So I'm gonna have to think about that. But like, how does having alternate possibilities prove that you're the source? Is it because you're controlling which possibility is actualized? Like, how do they relate? I'm just not sure.
Right.
Yeah.
You could do that. You can say Tempe doesn't really necessarily say, as far as I recall, how it proves that you're the source, other than the fact that you're not determined. So you're not determined, and so you are the ultimate source. Because if you were determined, he would say that you're not the ultimate source. You would be an instrumental source, which he finds does not ground freedom and blah, blah, blah. And that's a whole nother debate. But that's what we call actual sequence compatibilism, whereas you're the instrumental source, though you can be determined. That's like following Fisher, guidance control, Sartario, and all that fun junk. Tempe's view is like, if I put it on a spectrum, Tempe's view is like the closest you can get to compatibilism without actually being compatibilist, which is why I was reading the whole book and I was like, this is awesome. Because of course, like it's very close to my own view of actual sequence compatibilism minus the determinism. So really Tempe just has everything that I would agree with, except it's indeterminate because of the weak flickers. And so that proves the ultimate source, the indeterminism. But I want to reiterate, he does not argue that he's a libertarian because of the weak flickers. And he actually says towards the end of his book that you having these libertarians having these weak flickers in the Frankfurt-style argument, the Frankfurt-style counterexamples, that's and I quote, a serious lacuna of the libertarian position. Because then the libertarian has to argue something stronger, that those weak alternatives do ground responsibility. And he's saying they don't, so he evades all that mess and just says it grounds sourcehood, which is all he claims. And that's easier to argue. And I say, right on. We don't need the categorical alternatives like the libertarian is going to say. We just need the source. So his view is very close to the compatibilist view here. He just doesn't go so far as the libertarian does, which is a little bit farther in the spectrum. Libertarian is going to be stronger in their view. Source incompatibilism of the Tempe variety is close to compatibilism here. And then you add determinism or the compatibility of determinism, you get compatibilism. And then all those views.
So he's a step away for the most part. Like
in my
one
mind,
little thing.
Yes. In my mind, yes. He's just mildly a step away because all he claims is sourcehood just requires the falsity of determinism. And obviously, compatibilists could technically have that. Like guidance control is like I would say a millimeter away from Tempe's view, just because guidance control is compatible with indeterminism, right? And so that's why it's very hard in the free will debate to distinguish between those views because they're just so difficult. The issue though is that Tempe's going to say, well, if I were determined to do something, I'm not free. And obviously, guidance control is going to say, well, if you're determined to do something, you are free. So that's why they're still kind of apart. And that's the main thrust of the views, that we need to understand where determinism is placed in the sequence and if it is there or if it's not there.
Right. And that's something we're going to be fighting and arguing about for years to come, probably. But Colton, I really appreciate you coming on and diving further into the weeds with us. I know this episode's helped me a lot more than whenever you guys came on the first time. And so I think we did make some headway in the conversation tonight. And for that, brother, I am grateful. I will say to our listeners, if you did have trouble following along, go back and check out the other episodes. We dive more into explaining what guidance control is, modern reasons responsiveness, mechanism ownership, all of the things that we talked about tonight and more. Colton and Tyler actually came on the show to discuss those things a little bit. And I know we had about a 2.5 hour conversation on that one. So if you didn't follow, go back and listen to it. Check it out. I recommend all the books that was brought up tonight. I've got 4 of them now myself, 3 or 4 of them. And I look really into diving into these and getting on par with Colton whenever it comes to this, if that's possible. I don't know if it is, but I appreciate it, brother, for coming on. And so, Josh, anything you want to say, and as we wrap up?
I can say, as the least educated person in the room, that I feel like this brought a lot of clarity to me, and I was really excited to participate.
Yeah.
Thank you for your tired though steady countenance, Colton,
Yes.
and I appreciate your input. I am glad that this conversation happened, and I hope that those who listen to it, who are yet unfamiliar with most of the things that we're talking about, would be enticed enough to go back and listen to the entire series of conversations that we've had, because I feel like we're going deeper into this topic than many have, in a way that has not been done before. And I feel confident in saying that we're bringing a newness to the table that perhaps a lot of people haven't had ready access to. And I'm excited to see what God does with that.
Amen. Amen. Dale, closing words.
Yeah. So once again, I just want to say, yeah, thanks for letting me come back on and again play the role of the host and that sort of thing, or co-host, and asking Colton these clarifying questions about his view and kind of probing him a little bit. I like how you guys did the format this time. Like, let's probe each view kind of thing specifically. Okay, Colton's here, let's probe his view, and Tim's here, let's probe his view. So I think that's a good way to like get depth from both perspectives type deal. So yeah, thanks for bringing me on.
Anytime, brother. Anytime. Colton, any last things from you, and then I'll take us out.
No, it's an honor. It's a privilege, obviously. And so thank you so much, guys. I love the show. I love what you guys are trying to do. And I like to be a part of it whenever I can. So if you ever want to do a part 2, I'm willing. I'm ready.
We have to. We've got timestamps to get through, bro. So absolutely.
I have one question for you, Colton, before we go.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a joke, but sort of serious as well. I'm just curious. The dominoes. How dumb did I sound on that episode? Did it make any sense? Did you find it helpful, or did you think I was just totally off base? What was your take in general on that?
To be quite honest, I don't necessarily recall what you've argued there. And to be even more brutally honest, and no disrespect to you, I kind of toned it out a bit.
Okay, so I'm not going to be on the next
only because I agree. Like when Calvinists use like the domino model of providence or something, they don't know what they're talking. Like that has so many problems to me. The domino model of providence that I don't like using that analogy. I know Edwards is a big proponent of something similar to that view, Jonathan Edwards. There's better providence models, and I think the authorial model of providence is a better model to show how this is working in relation to divine determinism. And so I apologize.
No, not
that's my response. So
awesome, cool. Thanks, man.
All right, guys, we are out of here again. Colton, thank you so much for coming on. Andrew, just evening, gentlemen. Man, you missed it. You got to get on here earlier, brother. No, we try to do all of our live streams at 7 p.m. And so if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do that. It helps us out with the algorithms. We are that close, y'all, from 1,000 subscribers. So we're less than 100 now away. And so I'm excited to see it hit that milestone. But we need you. We need your help to get us out there and share. And I like what we're doing on this podcast. I reiterate what Josh said, just a few moments ago, that I think we're bringing in newness to this conversation, one that's readily accessible to everybody that doesn't have the materials that were referenced in this. I will put links to be able to access those. But I love what we're doing, and we're doing it in a Christ-like way. And so with that, I say, as I always say, good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.